So my title is Possessing Palestine, and this is the title of the book I'm writing. And I want to look at the idea of different groups of people coming to Palestine and the particular effects the idea of being in Palestine has on them. So this is particularly the messianic, this is going to be good, messianic tourists, of whom I'm going to talk about Masons as well, the Freemasons briefly, as that came up in my research, but also contemporary Palestinian healers, particularly in the Nablus area, Nablus and Jenin. So, my title is Possessing Palestine, and I know there is a big debate over terminology, and I would very much like feedback on people and the associations of the idea of what possession means, and I'm using it in a very broad sense, as you will see. In terms of my wider research, I have different historical actors, if you like, historical institutions and individuals who I'm looking at and understanding, particularly the British institutions and how they historically, as colonialists, as Orientalists, have attempted to possess Palestine. But I'm also interested in the idea of repossession, particularly contemporary repossession. So I go from things like pilgrims, tourists, crusaders, archaeologists, missionaries, any kinds of colonizer, to the idea of how do people now engage with their heritage, and particularly in acts of repossession. So my first invitation to Palestine came in 2004, and it was a dual invitation. I was invited because I worked, and I still work for 20 years now, at the Institute of Archaeology at University College London. And we have very colonial, Orientalist connections, if you like, with Palestine through figures like Sir Flinders Petrie. I don't know if you teach about him. Is he a bad guy or a good guy? Good guy, somebody says. Discuss in an essay, yeah. And this is him at Tel al-Ajul. And also Kathleen Kenyon, who of course was acting director during the war, and this is her at Jericho, obviously as well she dug at Jerusalem. So basically the institution where I work exists because of the Palestinian collection that Petrie collected. It was the legal basis of why the institute was constructed in the first place. So we're interested, and this is a separate thing that we've talked about before, about how we can make a kind of future for the collection which engages with Palestinians and not just see it as a kind of dead collection that is in the basement, which it is. So that was one. I had a former student, Ahmed Rajoub, who came to study with us, and he invited me to come and see kind of him in the West Bank, and to look around all the different organisations and the heritage organisations that are here in Palestine. And I was quite amazed at the vitality. I really got excited by the kinds of work that was happening here. The second part of my invitation had to do with the fact that I had a friend who was working at the Order of St John Eye Hospital, and he asked me to come as an anthropologist to look at cultural issues affecting why people did or didn't come for eye treatment. And again, the eye hospital, it has its Orientalist colonial origins, and it sees its predecessors in the the kind of the Hospitallers, the Crusader kind of identity. But it was revived in the 1880s to become a world charity that engages in eye care throughout Palestine. So in Hebron it has a branch, Anabta, many different places, as well as mobile clinics. So these were the two reasons I came to Palestine. And I was interested because there was a link between the idea of heritage but also health. And now it's very fashionable to have a new buzzword, which is well-being. And so well-being communicates something to do with what I'm interested in. But I also think heritage is about ill-being as well. So I want to talk about those relationships between whether heritage is something that empowers us or whether it is something that burdens us as well. So again, anybody coming to Jerusalem or writ large Palestine, depending on who you are and how you articulate it as Al-Quds, Jerusalem, Zion, it is about you going to some place that you assign an efficacy to. You wish to encounter something which is powerful, which is potent, which is transforming. So it's synonymous with pilgrimages, different journeys. It's a rites of passage. It's something that people do in a ritual manner. It's also a quest, a search that usually has moral or spiritual significance. But increasingly, during the time I've been here, we went to a briefing at OCHA, and we met trade unionists who were here to understand the facts on the ground, and it was very much a political awareness that they were seeking. So this idea of why people come, how are they hoping to be transformed, and by what information interests me. So also it's this idea of the sacred spaces, the centre of the world, where we can feel that we are more powerful. People at the centre feel much more powerful than the idea of being outside or in the periphery. Also the idea of revelation. The idea of coming to Jerusalem, to Al-Quds, to all of these places, is to have a revelatory experience. The idea that you kind of discover something or rediscover. And it's transformative. We want to come back different. It's like going on a Hajj. We wish to come back having something, have acquired something that changes our status. Also, it's a desire for wholeness when we feel fragmented. The former Catholic nun, Karen Armstrong, wrote about the idea that Jerusalem was a cure for inner dis-ease. So the idea of disease, but also dis-ease was part of it. And the idea it's redemptive. It's a place that you go to see some future emerge, or to define a future that you think is, powerful and gives well-being to yourself and your self-group, whoever that might be. But there's also, and it is also this, a moment where you can recreate the world. It's about engaging with a cosmology where you can recreate yourself in a new world scenario. But there's also a paradox to all of this, and usually there is to any kind of pilgrimage, which is the idea that there is also suffering. It might be about the idea of, having a cure, but also part of the passage is about the idea that you are going to suffer in some way. So it might be people walking around the Via Dolorosa with crosses. It might be, people travelling a long way. But it is this idea that you are having a very deeply felt emotional encounter. So I was interested in this, but I also got interested in the fact that in the first guidebook that I got, the Rough Guide to Jerusalem, it talked about the Jerusalem syndrome. And I don't know if people are familiar with the Messiah complex. Thank you very much. So this is the idea of a particular impact that Jerusalem is said to have on visitors, where people believe themselves to be a Messiah. So I read about this and thought, I'm sure I will be susceptible. I'm sure I'll be one of the people who will be in a white gown somewhere near some sacred place, acting out my Messiah complex. But this was seen as interesting going up to the millennium, because more foreigners, more visitors were seen to be affected by this. So it's this idea that it's a psychosis, it's some kind of breakdown or episode you have, and that it affects people over 7 days in 7 stages, and these are the stages: anxiety, agitation, nervousness, tension, the desire to be alone, to split away from your group, the idea of having cleansing rituals, the idea that you're obsessed with cleanliness, bathing, cutting your fingernails and your toenails. The fourth thing is the idea that you adopt a toga-like gown, which is always white. So in many of the hotels in the old city, people keep an eye out for missing bed linen in case one of the tourists has suddenly adopted it and is going around Jerusalem wearing it. Also the idea that you have a public recitation, that you feel compelled to go in the public space somewhere, read psalms, verses or hymns, and then go on a procession and march to Jerusalem's holy places. So this is a kind of stages, different stages that kind of lead up to this idea that you're going to deliver a redemptive sermon in a holy place, and the idea that it's here that you see yourself as a Messiah or a prophet, or you adopt a particular religious persona, whether it's Samson, Moses, Christ, or the Virgin Mary. So this is a very startling thing to happen in a place, the idea that a place overwhelms you enough to create this kind of behaviour. And so obviously the kind of best source to go to look at this thing is the Simpsons cartoon, because they actually had an episode that was where Homer Simpson, it's called The Greatest Story Ever Told, Homer Simpson comes to Jerusalem and he is affected, he believes he is the Messiah. And this really upsets Ned Flanders, who is his Christian fundamentalist who is there, can't believe that he isn't affected, and Homer Simpson, who to him really doesn't deserve it, is the one who's affected. So Homer believes he is the chosen one, he's the Messiah, and he wants to unite us all in a future religion called the Chrismu Jews, which, as the name suggests, unites Christians, Muslims and Jews. And the idea that a kind of, future of wholeness will come from the idea that everybody will be happy to worship peace and chicken, because that's the things that he thinks is shared by the Abrahamic religions. So there is this idea that's often people make it into a kind of comedy, it's something to laugh at, but also it's been taken very seriously by the British Journal of Psychiatry. So in the pages of the British Journal of Psychiatry, particularly coming up to the millennium, there was a discussion about this idea of messianic tourism, of the Jerusalem syndrome, and it being an illness rather than, anything else. It was seen as a psychiatric illness, and it was about depersonalisation. And depersonalisation is the idea that you are so affected by something that you forget who you are, and the idea of adopting a persona instead of your idea of your own self is what happens. So as they explain, or Elbar, who is the person who has written about this, talks about Jerusalem as having an idealistic collective subconscious image, and so people coming here expect to see a certain idea of Jerusalem, which is usually based on whichever holy book that you're engaged with, and that this conflicts with the idea of the reality of the modern city. So the idea of health, and whether you are going to allegedly go mad or whether you're going to stay sane, is based on how effectively you can bridge the worlds between, the kind of heritage you had in your mind and the idea of the heritage of the place you're engaging with. So this idea is the idea of psychotic decompensation, the idea that your identity is so affected that you lose a sense of yourself. So I was interested in this because the idea of either staying sane or going mad was based on the idea of how you manage both heritage and your health. And also the nature of the possessional acts, how you possess Palestine or how you possess Jerusalem is important here. And very much, with a kind of Orientalist line in it, very much it's a kind of Edward Said's work with the kind of possessive urge to basically colonise, to take over, to do this through archaeology and different mechanisms. But I do believe there are other ideas of possession going on here, and so I was interested in the idea about an alternative idea of possession where the place possesses you. You try to possess the place, but also the place possesses you. So again, the other side of the idea of possession is dispossession. And again, Edward Said, who's a particular hero of mine, has written quite a lot about the Palestinian situation, and particularly the idea of dispossession. Particularly the idea of being in exile in the broader sense of the word, the idea of disconnected from your heritage, and the idea that exiles feel an urgent need to reconstitute their broken lives, usually by choosing to see themselves as part of a triumphant ideology or restored people. So this triumphant ideology works like the Jerusalem syndrome. It's the idea of kind of trying to get wholeness from the idea of a broken history. So it's this the capacity. My English is gone. The capacity to possess is the capacity to make and remake the world and yourself. So this is what we do on a daily basis, but in some contexts it's even more extreme. And also Edward Said wrote about the idea that, he said, perhaps the greatest battle Palestinians have waged as a people has been the right to a remembered presence, and with that presence, the right to possess and reclaim a collective historical reality. So possessing a reality in terms of your history is seen as really important. So we have possession, dispossession, and we have this urge towards, the ability to, have a presence through the idea of possession. So one of the terrible ironies as well about the Jerusalem syndrome is that the place that people suffering from the syndrome, basically people are put into a clinic for 7 days, and the only way of actually curing the syndrome is to leave. It's basically so powerful. And they give an example of a Swiss lawyer who went on a trip in the Middle East. He was Mediterranean and Middle East. He was fine in Greece, he was fine in Egypt, but when he got to Jerusalem, he had a breakdown and they put him in a clinic. He was there for 7 days and then he was sent home. But as I say, the irony is that people were taken to Kafashol Mental Health Centre, which is actually built on the remains of Deir Yassin. So there is this, kind of alternative archaeology. And this is one of the, ironically again, sadly, one of the best preserved Arab villages because of the clinic being built there. And this is one of the ceremonies, alternative ceremonies that have been held at this site to remember the people who died at Deir Yassin. So again, the closeness of history, the idea of possession and dispossession is always, kind of quite close and very contested too. And here we get to the idea of the Tawfik Kanan collection, and I hope you're familiar with the Tawfik Kanan collection. Which way is the gallery? Is it up there, the collection? Is the museum there?
Yeah.
It's that way. That way. And under the title of Heritage Magic, the Kanan collection has, created a lot of interest from scholars. And it was an inspiration very much in my work to think differently about the nature of possession. So for those who don't know, Tawfik Kanan was a medical doctor, he was an ethnographer, a Palestinian, an intellectual, a polymath. He was interested in many things. He wrote so many books on so many subjects, including what he called folk life. But he was also a collector of amulets. And the collection, if you haven't seen it, is worth going to see, and it's quite incredible. So he was somebody who thought about heritage and well-being, and he understood all these connectivities between objects, persons, places, and substances, and that they were bound up in different efficacies. They could transform you into the sense that bring about well-being. So, he was talked about the kind of amuletic properties of different kind of enchanted heritages and wrote about them. And it has been very important to kind of understand heritage, and particularly a kind of popular heritage. So this is the idea that there are networks, cosmologies that link persons to things, whether it's blue beads or hands of Fatima or whatever it might be. and also to places in institutions and to ideas. Particularly things like the evil eye or the idea of jinn feature heavily in his work, and it has this kind of magical or mystical weight to it. And it's about everyday cure as well. It's about finding out how people, whether it's perhaps through eating certain herbs as well, kept their own idea of well-being in place. So again, this changes the notion of the idea of possessing as just something that human beings do to the material world, but the idea that you can be possessed by things, whether it is jinn or the evil eye, or you can be possessed by places in a way that is either, good for you, that you feel is about well-being, or ill-being. So the idea of having amuletic value is something that I have thought about and written about quite a bit, given this example of Canaan. So again, this idea of heritage magics or of heritage syndromes, I have been rethinking of it in terms of amuletic possession too. So questions I've raised in my work are questions such as, what is it to possess and also be possessed by heritage? And to raise questions such as, can certain, salient or significant heritage forms, whether they're objects, landscapes, ideas, substances, rituals, spirits, exert efficacies capable of transformative magical encounter? Also, can such loci affect cure and healing, or can they also turn otherwise so-called normal people mad? And one of the big things I think that Canaan and his research offered us is the idea to question, what is normalcy, what is it to be normal, and what is it to be mad? And that's a very important question to always ask. One person's mad person is sane to another. Also the idea of well-being and ill-being, and what we encounter and how we can manage our own well-being. And what is the role of heritage here? And also, how can heritage dispossess you? How can you feel dispossessed by a place that doesn't seem to respond to how you thought it would, or how it looked? And that this idea of being dispossessed is a particularly terrible thing to go through. So can heritage be redemptive? Can it be pathological, therapeutic or traumatizing? So this is really the psychodynamics of heritage I'm interested in. It relates to theology, ontology, cosmic sacred zones, to both visible and invisible worlds as well. So again, just to recap, this is also about depersonalisation and repersonalisation. So it's about making and remaking self and world. And again, on an everyday basis, we have different ideas of personality, where sometimes, somebody's child, we're sometimes a student, we have different roles in our own life. And this is the idea that we remake the world in a way that we wish to. Also, the Jerusalem syndrome is not alone. There is also a well-known or significant place syndrome, which might be called a heritage syndrome, and also non-place syndromes or traveller's syndrome. So whether it was Stendhal, who was travelling around Italy, who kind of was famous in a sense for, and known for the Stendhal syndrome, which was the fact that people performed a kind of ritual in front of Renaissance art, which was to pass out, to actually faint in front of beauty. And this was the idea that was the done thing, that this was the right way to behave. Freud at the Acropolis, Sigmund Freud, had what he called a disturbance of memory, where he had a sense of derealisation. He couldn't believe that the Acropolis was real, even though he knew it was real, and he said that this was something that accessed the subconscious. There is something called the Paris syndrome, which was diagnosed in the 1980s, and this is typically about tourists from Japan, particularly female tourists going to Japan, who expect a wonderfully romantic idea of Paris, and sometimes get overcome with the idea of romance, and have to hand themselves into the Japanese embassy and say, it's too much for me, I have to leave the country. There's also something called White House syndrome, where people turn up at the White House and they either demand to see the president because they wish to engage with efficacy and they think the president will get things done for them, or else they think they are the president. And I think this might be how George Bush got into power, but I wouldn't like to comment. He turned up and thought that was his job and they kept him on. There's also something called the non-place or the traveller or the airport syndrome, where people in very kind of, anonymous looking places or places that look the same, often, again, have some kind of episode where their personality is affected. So that you actually get people who are particularly on long-haul flights, whose serotonin levels might be bad, who go and say, I've got this passport, it says Beverley Butler, I don't know who she is, she looks very strange, I don't identify with her, and there is this idea of, needing to take time to re-engage with who you are. And Mark Auger has written quite well about non-places, so that's quite an interesting aspect. Also the idea of, is travel bad for you? And I was particularly interested in an article that came from the World Health Organization, which is a warning that said that travel can damage the mind. So the idea that the World Health Organization in 2009 issued a warning that the stress of international travel can lead to mental disorder in vulnerable people, especially if it's to places of historical and symbolic importance, which is quite interesting.
Yeah.
So again, there are different positions on the Jerusalem syndrome, different ways in which the act of possession is orchestrated. So sometimes it's the idea that you're mad, you go in the clinic, and that's, a kind of very much a regime of care that the clinic has, kind of performs. Also the idea of public drama. So many religious historians have said, actually, coming to Jerusalem and wearing a white sheet is actually a good messianic, religious experience, and people often say they enjoyed it. They enjoyed the idea that they were living a different kind of life, a different kind of personhood, and so that they see Jerusalem as actually quite hospitable to difference and a therapeutic zone in that way. And the other aspect I want to follow is the idea again of Palestinian and traditional and local healers. So again, we can think about Orientalist, colonialist, possessional acts, the crusaders, the collectors, the carers, and also the idea there is the idea that many people changed Jerusalem to be like it was in their imagination. So they would come to a place and say, this isn't like I thought it would be, whether it's from the Bible or from engravings. And people seek to transform this. So the Palestine exploration from people like Queen Helena with the splinters of the True Cross, the Palestine Exploration Fund, or the Israeli Western Wall experience where, they just recreate the whole idea of the temple. There is this idea of people literalising the possession. We literally changed Jerusalem to become what we thought it would be. And these kinds of, the messianic tourists, and particularly modern chivalric fraternities, those people who see themselves as inheritors of the kind of crusader mentality, have seen, for example, the Muristan, the centre, the Christian centre of the old city of Jerusalem, as an amuletic object. They went there, and there is a convergence in the 1920s and 30s of archaeologists, the Order of St. John, and the English Freemasons within this space. So basically, they want to be near places, physical places that they think are about their origins, and it's a claim to origin as they see it, and it's also dispossessing. And in terms of the Masons, the Freemasons, they see themselves as allegorical inheritors of the idea of being the Masons who built Solomon's temple. So their idea of possessing Palestine is actually to go to Solomon's quarries. And people used to particularly, including archaeologists actually, many archaeologists were Freemasons, to go to the quarries there and perform Masonic rituals. And this is an image of the first English lodge in the Holy Land, which was the lodge of King Solomon's Temple. So the idea of these kind of Masonic tourists, if you like, was the idea that they were very intent in picking up or making objects that had aspects of Jerusalem in them. So the first, this was an exhibition that I helped with. The slide on the top is the person who came in 1924 to authenticate the lodge, to basically, kind of ritualise its presence. And he was given many objects which were supposed to be from Solomon's times. Masons as well create many models of the temple. And also have the mallet. What do you call the mallet that the Masons have? It's a kind of... Judges have them. No, judges in court. What do you call them?
Ask the translator.
But she needs to translate from me, and if I don't know. But these are ceremonial objects that they have. Oh, it's like a mace, but they have, the best thing they can have is that they have stone from Solomon's quarries, and that makes it a magical object. And I'll remember it right at the end, or I'll remember it tonight at 12 o'clock. But also, one of the Freemasons who was part of all of this kind of origins of modern Freemasonry was Warren. So, he was very much interested in digging at the Muristan site and in the quarries, and also Kathleen Kenyon had, some excavations at the Muristan. So this is colonial, this is kind of, the Mandate period, and particularly for something like the Eye Hospital, the St John Eye Hospital, they have, they have tried to move away from this kind of crusader, this problematic, history that they were attached to, and they would probably now laugh at the idea that, they take this seriously, even though they dress in their, kind of vestments now and again. And I did want to make mention of one group of Masonic tourists who were the Templars, the Knight Templars, who raised over £700,000 for the Eye Hospital's satellite site in Anabta. So there are quite shifts of, kind of ideas of affiliations, and a lot of giving, a lot of people give money to St John. So the other part of my lecture was the idea of, heritage and well-being in terms of working with the St John. So I would go out with the ambulances, I would talk to people about how they looked after their well-being, particularly their eyes, obviously, because that was something they were interested in. And this was one of my colleagues there, Dr. Nick Sargent, was compiling a report which is about a rapid assessment of avoidable blindness. So this was the kind of document that I was engaged with. And also, when we were doing this, trying to find out more about things like spirit possession or jinn. Some people do believe in the jinn, other people don't believe in the jinn. So it was interesting to find out, different research going on. So this is Celia Rothenberg's book, which is interesting, called Spirits of Palestine. And she basically walks in the footsteps of Dr. Hilma Granquist. And so she's kind of, it's a bit like a kind of Taufik Kanan, but this was a female. I think she was Danish.
She was, Finnish.
Finnish, but she spoke Swedish. I'm getting my Scandinavian context wrong. But she worked just outside Bethlehem at Artas, this was Granquist, looking at the nature of spirit possession. So Rothenberg follows this up And she says that it's interesting that at least 12% of people talk about going to healers. And the idea of jinn in particular is the idea that you're possessed, you're worn by, or you wear a jinn. So she was interested in the idea that, it was a difference. It's a bit like the Jerusalem syndrome. It was a depersonalisation. It changed your identity. It gave you a sense of perhaps ill-being as well. But she said it was an externalised social self, and that your identity was eclipsed or subsumed by the jinn. But she also, and of the many power-laden aspects of the jinn as well, and of the healers, I'm not presenting healers here as a great substitute for biomedical care, but the idea that, there is power residing in these things. But she also said it was a powerful resource for grappling with the complexities of everyday life. And she said it often helped people in adversity or extremis, and particularly due to the occupation, more people, even if it was just due to the fact that people couldn't get through checkpoints, or people, the wall was being built, that people did turn more and more to healers. So the idea of, dealing with losses, small and large, then it was a safe outlet to actually talk about your anxiety in terms of the jinn. And she actually thought it was quite a powerful thing, particularly for women. So she focuses on cases where women articulate a problem that they wish to solve, which is based on, gender difficulties, and she says that this is a way in which they did it. So I was interested in this book, but also in the idea that archaeology as well, and I don't know if people are aware, you probably know this paper, which is about archaeological heritage and spiritual protection. So this is about looters who work with the jinn in Palestine to identify artefacts for illegal sale. So this was a particular study where this person was looking at a large number of antiquities looters who rely on the services of spirits or jinn to identify the location of protected treasures. And in the field work, he interviews 73 individuals who regularly use jinn. And often they used children as well, that children were possessed, and children would say to people where they felt that the important objects were. So this, this was interesting to me, but it also, I was interested in asking different healers how they, felt about this. So just as we were going to this, the Red Crescent to present this paper, we also saw this at the Kalandia checkpoint that says, "New Israeli brand of racism." And it says, that you probably can't see, it says major side effects: apartheid, occupation, genocide, ethnic cleansing, poverty, approved by the US government. This is all on this kind of pseudo, medicine bottle that was graffitied near the Kalandia checkpoint. So I was interested in this idea of, repossessional acts, particularly this idea of the jinn. And I went to Professor Abdeen, who is part of the Nutrition, Health and Research Institute at Al-Quds University. And I asked about the different definitions of well-being that might be appropriate to Palestine, and he talked about well-being, about feeling at harmony within yourself and your surroundings. So the idea of place was important. The idea that in public policy now, they took on not only the biomedical but psychosocial world. So they took in this idea of, the if you like, the psychological aspect of heritage. But also he talked about the major role that healers and religion, and particularly spiritual engagement, had. So whether you call it folklore or popular heritage, traditional cultural knowledge was very important. So both tangible but also intangible heritage. He also talked about well-being being about strengthening the family and the community and the sense of connectedness and rootedness. And without that, people obviously, are anxious. And he talked about a return to traditional efficacies being pragmatic, perhaps because of the occupation, perhaps because of costs, and also the popular fear or failure of people in white coats, the biomedical, constituency. Also, just the idea of, edging your bets. So if you're not, cured by going to a hospital or a clinic, then why not go to a healer? Why not, try and get some other kind of assistance to your well-being? So I undertook this research with Samia Sawala from Asira, above Nablus. So it was in the north. And we went to see many different people, and we were kind of stretching the idea of healing too. So this was very much a shift from things like the biological eye to the idea of alternative visions of the evil eye, and how the evil eye might possess you and how you could protect yourself. But also the idea that people liked communing with that which was efficacious. So we went to religious sheikhs, the idea of, I can't say sheikh properly, so my English is... terribly destructive to the Arabic language, I apologise. But the idea of religious healers, and this is in Syris, in Jenin, and this was a person who worked with healing through reading the Quran and also using herbs. So very much when we talked to him and we were kind of discovering what he thought healing was all about, he said he was there to be a figure of care and comfort, but also authority. He said it mattered that people thought he had some power, that he was different, if you like. It was about spiritual guidance. And he said it wasn't only to deal with trying to alleviate illness in people, but also their families and their friends as well. So often he said it was the families of people, particularly with mental health problems, which he specialised in. He said it was often the families and the friends who also suffered. So he would recite from the Quran, and he said it was the voice that was efficacious. And every time I went there was usually something wrong with me as well. So I was always identified to have the evil eye everywhere I go. Even if I went to 4 healers in a day and I got cleansed every time, the evil eye would still be with me. But he would, pick up some water in a cup and say, voice, kind of passages from the Quran, and the idea that I would drink them, so I would ingest it. So he said he believed in jinn, both good and evil, and this was, from the surah. So he said, this was part of what he saw as religion, but he said he didn't work with jinn. Other healers said they did, but he said he believed in them. And he also said that his special interest was in what you might call mental health illness. And he was also made me aware that, the root of the idea of jinn is also the idea of being mad, or the idea of being hidden and invisible, one whose intellect is hidden as well. He also said the idea about objects, the idea of having beads or hands of Fatima was not something that he practiced, that the only beads you could have is the prayer beads, and he thought that amulets were haram, that they were forbidden and that they weren't very, good. But he said he dealt in natural cures that were created by God. So in contrast to him, we also went to see a sorcerer, or we went to see a few sorcerers, magicians as they say, in his magic room. And there was very much a different idea of what, healing was going to be here, and very much kind of old theatre. You went in this magic room and there was incense burning, and it was very dramatic. And this was the idea of, having a different magical and religious text there. So this man, believed in astrology. He had lots of different texts spanning many different kinds of cosmologies and, kind of belief systems. He said he could conjure visions up. He could conjure visions of people in different parts. So if I wanted to see my family, he could conjure a vision of my family for me to see it. He was also into fortune telling, so the idea of knowing your future. But the key problem that he dealt with, and many other healers as well, was the idea of fertility problems. So women wishing to have children and coming across problems. There was many women actually went to him. Or people wanting wealth, many people across the world want wealth. Success, and also romance. Romance was a big deal. But he also said, and this is the thing that kind of often, scared people, was the idea that he worked with jinn, good and bad. So he could also revenge, kind of people who you disliked. So you could go to him and say, I really don't like my colleague. Please could you, make sure he doesn't get success and I do. I was very tempted. I was good. But the idea that he could work with these, was part of his, kind of often what he does. Also the idea of Samaritan priests as well. So in Nablus city there's a whole road dedicated to Samaritan priests. And this is very much the healer as other. And believing in somebody else, and with Samir, who I was with, was also this problem of being seen near the Samaritan district as well, because it was problematic. It perhaps wasn't the best thing to do. But I asked the Samaritan how he dealt with all of these things, and he said he was about safeguarding well-being. He wanted to counter psychological pain, and also he was into the idea of ritual or re-ritualisation. So he had the ability to either reconnect people, so if you did like and wanted a romance with somebody across the road, you could connect yourself to them by scattering some bits of paper with your name and their name on it, or water that had been blessed by him, or you could disconnect with people who you disliked, and you could do it in a reverse ritual. So it was the use of substances, scripts, and it was about, yes, I've only got using substances, scripts, so he would write as well, and this would be, kind of in different kinds of script, based as well on your mother's name. And I was foolish enough to say, why is it your mother's name, not your father's name? And he quite rightly said, you can always be sure who your mother is, but perhaps not your father. I lead a sheltered life. So it was about ritual change, all of those kinds of things. And one thing he did say as well was the idea that often he would give placebos. He would just give people water in a bottle, and he would tell them to pour out a certain amount and to drink it, even though he knew it was just water. But he said people had, a change of mentality this way. So also interfaith healing, I'll have to go through these quickly because I know we need to have some kind of discussion, but you probably know this more than I do, but either what's called the St George Church or Cathedral at Al-Qadr near Bethlehem, which has relics from St John, is seen to be quite an important shrine both for Christians and for Muslims. And again, it's synonymous in the 19th century with psychiatric treatment of mental illness, and the idea that St George's relics can help you overcome this. So this is the chain that was believed to be the bridle on St George's horse, and you pass it round your body. I got it tangled in my hair and they had to cut bits off, but I gave myself to St George. Also the idea of, after conflict, care after conflict. So we did want to kind of shift the idea of what well-being was. So we visited the old city of Jenin, which of course in 2002 has substantial, destruction. So we're interested in the idea. This was a person who had a pharmacy, a place where you could buy herbs and all of these things. But his big narrative was about how he restored the family business. The idea of how do you safeguard yourself in a conflict zone. So everyday well-being. And this is a picture of his shop when it was, kind of lost to destruction. Again, return to tradition, people preferring herbs over chemical cures, and the idea that people don't trust what's in chemical medicine. And this was a man who worked in the old city there. He had a crocodile. I don't know if you can see the crocodile. He had things all over the shop. It was amazing. And the idea that was about homemaking, because he had been displaced, or his family had, and him in 1948 he'd come to there, and he said it was all about homemaking and also the family business. I'm going fast. Also you have New Age medicine. Nablus city in particular, you have people who are doing complementary medicine, holistic medicine, distance healing, New Age, and many of these people are trained in either Morocco or in this case Leicester in the UK, which is a university I used to go to. But again, this is the idea of, kind of a more international idea, I suppose, of healing that is to do with, again, kind of New Age tradition. The land is efficacious. So the idea of, the soil, and I went to see different people who were working on the land, whether it was, sponsored by US aid as a corporate culture or by co-ops. But this is the idea of, literally the food of Palestine is healing, and to grow it in the soil was a very important thing. And obviously it was about the future in terms of exports, and about, at the time, people were exporting to Sainsbury's and different brands, you know, kind of globally. And also the idea of home as amulet. So I can talk about the people we didn't get to see and the problematics of trying to find healers. But again, I had the evil eye. Me and a small child, one of Samir's sons, we were both seen to have the evil eye. And a friend of his mother's was called, and she opened this little shrine in her house, and she had the salt ready there, put the salt in her hand and did this round my head, and if the salt went wet, she'd taken the evil eye from me. She also had a fear bowl, which Canan writes about, the fear cups. You know, the idea that when you are in fright, when your soul is shocked, that this calms you down. And lastly, the idea of it being ongoing. So when me and Samir were looking for magic, everything was magic. So we have the magic touch hairdressers. We decided the whole world was magic. And also I just went recently to see his family, and they were talking about others who were collecting these amulets with writing on that they kept in their pockets. Or even, you know, protection of houses, which also showed that you've been on the Hajj as well. You know, how do we create our homes in a sense that, you know, is about our well-being and about our efficacy. So, thank you. Halas.